Okay, so the first set of readings you had was Northrop Frye's Motive for Metaphor, and then the annotated Beauty and the Beast that appeared on the Sir Lillian website. So uh, Northrop Frye is very important for us. He gives us a foundation of a lot of different ideas that are related to the readings that you've already done, but that you were assigned to do, and also I think provides a good context for you going into the research as well. And so, major ideas brought up by Frye, things that we talk about in the classroom that you and I didn't get a chance to talk about, obviously, because of the web format. He starts with the question, what good is the study of literature? He suggests to you that it can make you a better person in terms of your openness to different ideas, your religious thoughts, your political thoughts and views, and the way that you interact with the world around you. He fully admits that it's not the kind of thing that's necessarily going to provide you status socially or material income, but that there's an important result to studying literature that has to do with your well being as a person and your ability to function as a citizen. He points out, in his opinion, that illiteracy is a fundamental problem equivalent to hunger or a lack of shelter, and it prevents you from being a participant in your society. Now, he talks about the study of the language, and then out of the language, what he calls the mother tongue, in our case, English, or most of our cases, English. Maybe in your case, it's not English, so you can think of your own mother tongue. But he says, out of the language, necessarily what you get then is a literature, an artistic expression of the language, and we're going to see that idea in Googie later on with decolonizing the mind as well. So he goes on to talk about the difference between the objective reality that we see with our eyes, the scientific observation of the world around us, and he says the imagination, the function of the imagination, is when you look at that world, he says you have desire, and desire is the seed of the imagination. And so the imagination, according to Frye, is our way of constructing models of possible human experience, is what he says. And that's a very important idea. So when we think about something like a fairy tale, or any story really, or a piece of artwork, the design of a building, any of those kinds of things, that is an imaginative expression. It is a construct of our mind, our way of trying to shape a possible model of human experience. And he says this is what we do. We take the world that we see, the world in which we live. There is a world in our mind that we say, this is the world I want to live in, that differs from the world in which I do live. And then our imagination allows us to begin the process of terraforming that environment into one that we're more comfortable with. And so he mentions the airplane. That's his big metaphor. And the point he's trying to make is that the scientific process, the way that a scientist thinks, and that process is fundamentally not different than the process of imaginative thinking. And so one of the big takeaways is he says people tend to think of science and imagination, or science and art, as beginning in the same place, that is with an idea, and then expressing that idea in different ways. And so moving outward, science moving out towards reason, towards the intellect, towards the observable world, and the artist moving off in the direction of imagination. He says that's fundamentally wrong. What happens is we begin in different places. So the artist will begin over here with the imagination. The scientist will begin here with what they see, reason and intellect, and the two will come together. Okay, so they're not divergent processes, they're convergent processes, he says. So the point in the middle is a highly developed art, highly developed science, indistinguishable, and we see that throughout history with people like Da Vinci and Darwin and Newton and so on. So that's an important concept for you as students, well beyond the confines of this classroom. So something important to think about. Now, the airplane, he says, works that way because people observed birds flying, decided they wanted to fly, they had a desire to fly. In the mind, they had a concept of a human experience in which flight was possible, and so they tell stories about flight, and then those stories necessarily are taken then by people, scientists, engineers, inventors, and they try to make machines for flight, and this was happening thousands of years ago. and then those machines fail, and so there's a new story, a new conception of flight, and then a new machine, and then a new story, until one day you get an airplane that actually can take a person into the air. He says, so does that mean that in a scientific age, we're not going to need poetry and stories anymore? He says, absolutely not. Dispense with those ideas. He says, actually, it's just as important as ever, because in his words, the airplane, we don't get into airplanes to fly. He says we get into airplanes to get someplace faster. In other words, he says it wasn't about whether or not we could fly. It was a rebellion against the tyranny of time and space, he says. And we're still engaged in that rebellion now. That's why after airplanes, then you had stories about rockets going into space, and then you actually have the rockets going into space, and then you have stories about people going to other planets. You actually have people going to the moon, and now we're not far probably from sending people to Mars and then deep space travel and so on. So he says this is the process, and it's an important process, and it shapes cultures, it shapes the world, it shapes our worldview, and it shapes the way that we relate to one another. So if you think about Beauty and the Beast, if you want real clear connections between the essay and that particular fairy tale, all fairy tales fall into that idea of a construct of a human experience. But in this particular version of Beauty and the Beast, remember, Beauty uses her imagination to change the environment in which she lives. She has this dream that comes to her where she sees the beast as the prince that he actually is, and then through that desire, she's able to bring that to reality. And so that's one particular connection you could make. But then, as you move into the essay project, you can break out of these couplings, out of these sets of readings, and think about the ideas more broadly. But that's some of the stuff we talked about in class, so I hope that's helpful. Hope that sparks some stuff for you, clears some stuff up for you. This is already getting longer than I wanted it to be, so I'll move on to the next set.